Another election and another coalition accusation that Labor is trying to sneak in a carbon tax.
What Labor has is a tax, a sneaky carbon tax on traditional industries in this country.
Given that this seems to pop up nearly every election, let's unpack this bit by bit and set the record straight. To start with, we need to look at the bigger picture of climate policy in this country. Last year, the Morrison government pledged to reduce our emissions to net zero by 2050, a target Labor had already agreed to back in 2015. This is in line with where the rest of the world is heading, to prevent the Earth from heating to 2 degrees Celsius. But scientists say deep cuts also need to be made by 2030, which means we need to start cutting emissions right now to stop the world heating to catastrophic levels. Scientists say countries like Australia need to cut emissions by at least 50% by 2030. But so far, the coalition has only pledged to cut emissions by roughly half this amount, and much less than other major economies. This is where Labor differs. They're pledging to cut emissions by 43% by 2030, which brings us a little more in line with our allies. So an obvious question is, how are we going to cut emissions to reach those 2030 and 2050 targets? Well, one idea is to make our biggest industrial polluters gradually cut emissions and pay if they emit too much. This could be done by providing industries with an emissions limit, or what is called a baseline. And if they went over the baseline, they would have to pay the government to offset their excess pollution. The idea is that this would incentivize industries to make changes to their operations to reduce emissions, like maybe investing in cleaner technology. And by doing so, they would avoid having to pay the government. So let's say, for example, the government has imposed an emissions limit of 100,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. If Factory X emits more than that, it would have to buy carbon offsets from the government. Seems like a pretty obvious way to reduce emissions, right? Well, this is the idea that Morrison is now claiming equals a sneaky carbon tax. But guess who came up with that idea? The coalition. In 2014, the government of climate skeptic Tony Abbott, remember this guy, legislated this exact policy. But of course, they didn't call it a carbon tax, they called it a safeguard mechanism. Now, the safeguard mechanism hasn't quite worked out as intended. The coalition government has never really enforced the mechanism, and it allowed companies to pretty much move the goalposts and increase their baselines without penalty. So if the original emissions baseline for Factory X was 100,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide a year, but it emitted 110,000 tonnes, it could make a successful argument to the government that it needed to bump its limit up to that level. This means Factory X can claim it didn't breach the baseline and can avoid paying carbon offsets. As a result of this policy never really being enforced, big industry has actually increased its emissions by 7% since 2016. In other words, the coalition's safeguard mechanism had the opposite effect of what was originally intended. Instead of reducing emissions, it resulted in more emissions. What Labor is now proposing to do is take the same coalition policy and actually enforce it. Instead of polluting companies shifting goalposts and getting away with increasing pollution, Labor is proposing to fix those baselines and gradually cut them over time to help reduce emissions. Modelling used by Labor says if it took this approach, it could cut emissions by 213 million tonnes by 2030. Now, we don't exactly know what those proposed baselines are because Labor says they won't be decided until after it's in government, assuming that Labor wins. The party has said that it will work with industry to set those baselines. But it's very odd for Morrison to claim Labor is proposing a carbon tax when in reality Labor's just taking the coalition's existing policy and improving it. So is the PM right? Is Labor introducing a carbon tax? The short answer, no. If you like this fact check, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and download our app.